The snow did not care about justice. It only cared about burying what was weak. 31 miles. That was the distance between the town that had stripped her of her dignity and the high, unforgiving timberline of the frozen mountain pass. Sarah Miller dragged her right foot forward, the torn sole of her leather boot scraping against a jagged edge of ice. A fresh trail of dark, heavy crimson dotted the pristine white powder behind her. Her feet had been bleeding for the last 10 miles, the cold numbing the agony just enough to keep her moving, but not enough to let her forget that she was dying. She clutched her threadbare grey shawl tighter around her shoulders, her fingers blue and stiff. Beneath the thin layers of her faded skirt, her other hand instinctively rested over her lower abdomen. She was 4 months pregnant. The child had not moved in hours, silenced by the bitter cold that was slowly seeping into Sarah's bones. "Keep moving," she whispered to herself, the words fracturing into white mist against the freezing air. Just keep moving. Every time she closed her eyes, the wind seemed to carry the sounds of the town square. It had only been 2 days, but the memory burned like a hot iron pressed to her skin. Her husband had died of winter fever less than a month ago. Before the soil on his grave could even freeze, his younger brother Thomas had stood before the town magistrate and called her a thief. She could still hear Thomas's voice, loud and carrying over the sleet-drenched square. "She stole the deed to the property. She's carrying a bastard child and trying to claim my brother's land." It was a lie so bold, so meticulously crafted, that the town, eager for a scandal to warm their dull winter, swallowed it whole. No one looked at the cracked silver locket she held, the one her husband had given her. No one asked why Thomas had locked her out of her own home in the dead of night. The women who used to buy bread with her turned their faces away. The men laughed, calling her a burden. They stripped her of her name, her property, and her right to exist within the settlement, driving her out into the harsh frontier with nothing but the clothes on her back. A brutal world had no mercy for a pregnant widow. In the frontier, hunger and cold were the true law, and Thomas had counted on the winter to finish the job he had started. Sarah stumbled, her knee hitting the frozen crust of the snow. A sharp gasp tore from her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, erratic and weak. She looked up through the howling wind, the blue storm light fading into the heavy gray of twilight. If she did not find shelter before the sun dipped below the pines, she and her unborn child would freeze to death on the trail. Then she smelled it. Wood smoke. It was faint, weaving through the sharp scent of pine and ice, but it was there. She forced herself upward, her bleeding heels crying out in protest. She crested a small, snow-choked ridge, and there it stood. A solitary trapper's cabin clung to the edge of a frozen creek. The logs were dark and weathered, sealed tight against the wind. From the stone chimney, a thick plume of gray smoke rose into the sky. Golden firelight bled through the cracks of the heavy wooden shutters. To Sarah, it looked like the gates of heaven. But this was not heaven. This was the territory of Gideon Frost. Even in town, 30 miles away, they whispered his name with a shudder. He was the man the town had cast out years ago, a trapper who lived by the blade and the rifle. They said he was a savage, a man who had let the wilderness claim his soul after his wife died of the pox, a death the town had refused to help treat. They said he would shoot a trespasser before asking their name. Sarah did not care. Fear of a man was nothing compared to the slow, suffocating grip of the freezing snow. She dragged herself down the ridge, her vision blurring at the edges. 30 yards, 20 yards, 10 yards. Through the roaring wind, a sharp, rhythmic sound cut through the air. Thwack, thwack. Beside the cabin, a massive figure stood over a chopping block. Gideon Frost. He wore a heavy bear-hide vest over thick flannel, his broad shoulders easily swinging a heavy iron axe. He did not look like a monster, but he looked like the mountain itself, immovable, rugged, and entirely indifferent to the fragility of human life. Sarah's legs finally gave out. She collapsed into the snowbank just 10 feet from the porch, her torn boots fully exposed, the cracked silver locket spilling from her frozen fingers onto the white ground. The sound of the axe stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Sarah lay in the snow, her chest heaving, her hands desperately covering her belly in a final, futile gesture of protection. She waited for the shout. She waited for the gunshot. She waited for the cruelty of men to reach her one last time. Instead, she heard the heavy crunch of leather boots in the snow, stepping slowly, deliberately, toward her. The heavy boots stopped mere inches from her face. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, her body curling inward. The freezing wind whipped at her threadbare shawl, but the massive shadow cast by the man blocked the worst of the gale. Gideon Frost stood over her. His pale, piercing blue eyes took in the scene with the cold calculation of a man who survived by missing nothing. He saw the frayed edges of her wool skirt. He saw the unnatural pale blue tint of her lips. He saw the cracked silver locket half buried in the snow. And then his gaze shifted downward. He saw her boots. The soles were completely detached, bound together by nothing but frozen mud and sheer willpower. Dark, fresh blood stained the snow beneath her heels. She had not wandered away from a broken wagon down the road. The blood trail stretched back as far as the eye could see, disappearing into the tree line. She had walked miles. His jaw tightened. A faint, healed scar across the bridge of his nose seemed to stretch as his expression darkened. "Please," Sarah whispered. Her voice was barely a rasp, broken and dry. "My baby." She did not ask for her own life. She did not beg for food. Her frozen, bruised fingers merely tightened over the slight swell of her stomach. Gideon did not speak. He had sworn a long time ago, standing over a fresh grave, that he would never let the affairs of the town cross his threshold again. The people of the valley were cruel, selfish creatures who only sought out the mountain when they needed someone to bleed for them. He had spent 5 years perfecting his isolation. He had spent 5 years learning to ignore the ghosts. But a pregnant woman bleeding in the snow was not a ghost. It was an absolute, undeniable reality. Gideon knelt. The movement was slow, deliberate, entirely devoid of the sudden jerks that would frighten a wounded animal. He did not ask her name. He did not ask who had done this to her. Questions wasted time, and time was heat, and heat was the only currency that mattered out here. Without a word, he slid one massive, calloused hand under her knees and the other behind her back. Sarah flinched instinctively, a gasp tearing from her throat. She expected roughness. She expected the brutal grip of a man claiming property. But Gideon's hold was astonishingly steady. He lifted her from the snowdrift as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. He held her away from the cold metal of his belt, keeping her close enough to share his body heat, but respectful enough not to crush her. He turned toward the cabin and kicked the heavy oak door open with his boot. The sudden wave of heat that washed over Sarah was so intense, it felt like a physical blow. The cabin was a single large room, dominated by a massive stone hearth where a fire roared, consuming thick logs of dry pine. The walls were lined with pelts, the floor swept clean, and the air smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and old leather. It was not a savage's lair. It was a fortress. Gideon carried her to a rough wooden cot in the corner, covered in thick wolf and deer hid. He set her down gently, stepping back immediately to give her space. Sarah curled into herself on the pelts, her body shuddering violently as the extreme cold clashed with the heat of the room. The pain in her feet, previously dulled by the ice, now woke up with a vengeance, burning like thousands of needles piercing her flesh. A quiet, pathetic whimper escaped her lips. She hated herself for the sound. She had promised herself she would not cry in front of the men who hurt her. Gideon did not look at her with pity, nor with annoyance. He simply turned his back to her, walked to the iron stove, and poured hot water from a kettle into a tin basin. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years alone. He grabbed a clean cloth, a jar of strong-smelling pine salve, and walked back to the cot. He set the basin on the floor and looked at her feet. "I have to take the boots off." His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. It was the first time he had spoken. It wasn't a request, but it wasn't a threat either. It was a simple statement of survival. Sarah nodded weakly, her eyes wide, watching his hands. Gideon knelt on the floorboards. His large, rough hands, heavily scarred from years of setting traps and fighting the wilderness, reached for her torn leather boots. He moved with agonizing care, unwrapping the frozen, bloody leather from her heels. When the fabric stuck to the dried blood, he used the warm water to soften it, never once pulling roughly, never once losing his patience. As he worked, Sarah's racing heart began to slow. The wild, frantic terror of the trail began to recede, replaced by a strange, heavy exhaustion. She watched the top of his dark, unruly hair as he cleaned the cuts on her feet. The town had called him a monster. They said he was a brute who had lost his humanity. Yet here he was, a man whose hands could break a wolf's neck, gently washing the bleeding feet of a woman he did not know. He applied the pine salve. It stung sharply, but the burning quickly faded into a soothing warmth. He wrapped her feet in clean, dry bandages. Then he stood up, grabbed the thickest pelt on the cot, and pulled it up over her shoulders, tucking it carefully around her shivering frame. "Drink," he said, handing her a tin cup of warm water. Sarah took it with trembling hands. She drank. It tasted like ash and iron, but it was the best thing she had ever swallowed.
"You're safe now."
She lowered the cup, her heavy eyelids fighting a losing battle against sleep. She looked at the man standing near the fire, a dark silhouette against the golden light. She had found the most dangerous man in the mountains, and for the first time in 2 days, she felt completely, undeniably safe. The blizzard hit the cabin an hour after sunset. It did not announce itself with a gentle snowfall. It slammed into the timber walls with the force of a runaway freight train. The wind howled down the stone chimney, rattling the heavy iron latch on the door and threatening to tear the wooden shingles from the roof. Inside, the fire crackled fiercely, holding the darkness at bay. Sarah woke with a gasp, her heart pounding, as a particularly violent gust of wind shook the cabin. Disoriented, her hands scrambled over the thick wolf pelt covering her, instinctively seeking the familiar swell of her belly. The baby was there, safe, warm. She let out a ragged breath, her head falling back against the rough fabric of the pillow. Her body felt heavier than lead, the kind of deep, aching fatigue that settled into the marrow of the bones after outrunning death. Her feet throbbed, but the sharp, biting agony of the frostbite had been replaced by a dull, manageable ache under the thick bandages. She turned her head. Across the room, Gideon Frost sat at a heavy wooden table. The warm glow of an oil lantern illuminated the sharp, weathered planes of his face. He was cleaning a Winchester rifle, his large hands moving over the metal and oiled wood with practiced mechanical precision. He had not removed his heavy boots. He sat facing the door, his broad shoulders squared, a silent sentinel in the dark. Sarah tried to sit up, but her limbs refused to cooperate. A quiet groan slipped past her lips. Gideon's hands stopped. He didn't turn his head immediately, but his pale blue eyes shifted toward her corner. "Don't move," he said, his voice cutting through the sound of the storm outside. The frostbite was D.P. "You walk on those feet now. You'll tear the skin right back open." I didn't mean to wake you," Sarah whispered, her voice still hoarse. "I wasn't sleeping." Gideon set the cleaning rag down. He stood, towering in the small space, and walked over to the iron stove. He poured a dark, steaming liquid into a tin mug and brought it to the cot. "Willow bark tea. It'll kill the fever before it sets in." Sarah reached for it. As she shifted, her hand brushed against the pocket of her ruined skirt. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked through her chest. Her hand dug frantically into the fabric. Empty. "My locket," she gasped, her eyes darting around the cot. The silver locket it was. Here, Gideon reached into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out the cracked silver locket. It was tarnished, the hinge bent from where she had dropped it in the snow. He held it out to her, not by the chain, but resting in the center of his massive palm. Sarah snatched it from him, clutching it to her chest as if it were the only anchor keeping her tethered to the earth. She realized too late how aggressive the gesture was, how much she looked like a beaten dog expecting a kick. She shrank back into the pelts, her eyes wide, waiting for his anger. Men in her life, especially Thomas, did not tolerate disrespect. They demanded gratitude. But Gideon just looked at her. His face remained an unreadable mask of weathered stoicism. He didn't demand a thank you. He didn't ask why a broken piece of silver mattered so much to a woman who had nearly frozen to death. "I found it in the snow," he said quietly. "Figured it meant something." "It's all I have left," Sarah whispered, staring down at the cracked metal. "My husband gave it to me on our wedding day. It's the only proof." She stopped, biting her lower lip. She had been about to say it was the only proof she had ever been loved. Gideon pulled a stool close to the fire and sat, resting his forearms on his knees. Proof won't keep you warm, he said softly. It's all they left me, Sarah said, the injustice of it finally breaking through her exhaustion. A single tear slipped down her flushed cheek, hot and fast. They took the house. They took the horses. Thomas, my brother-in-law, he stood in the square and told everyone I stole the deed. He said the child wasn't his brother's. He said I was a whore, and they believed him. She choked on a sob, her hands trembling. They watched him throw me out into the snow, and they just laughed. Gideon stared into the fire. The flames danced across his pale eyes. He knew the town. He knew the magistrate, the shopkeepers, the righteous men who sat in the front pews on Sunday and turned a blind eye to cruelty on Monday. 5 years ago, his wife Martha had fallen ill during a brutal winter. Gideon had ridden through a storm to beg the town doctor for me. Seen. The doctor had refused to open his door because Gideon didn't have the cash in hand, only pelts. Martha had died shaking in this very bed. The town hadn't changed. They were still cowards who worshipped money and feared anything that disrupted their comfort. The wind out here, Gideon said slowly, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the small room. It'll strip the bark off a pine tree, but it doesn't lie. It doesn't betray you. It just is. He turned his head to look at her. The intensity in his eyes made Sarah's breath catch. You're not property, Gideon said, the words carrying a strange, heavy weight. And you're not in their town anymore. You're in my cabin, and nobody bleeds in my cabin unless I say so. It wasn't a romantic vow. It wasn't a flowery promise of eternal salvation. It was a statement of frontier fact, delivered by a man who had the power to enforce it. Sarah looked at this lonely, scarred man, realizing that the rumors had been entirely wrong. He wasn't a beast, he was a shield. Drink the tea, Gideon instructed, turning back to the fire. Try to sleep, the storm will last through tomorrow. Sarah brought the tin cup to her lips. The tea was bitter, but it sent a rush of heat straight to her core. She lay back down, pulling the wolf pelt to her chin. Through the dim light, she watched Gideon. He didn't go to bed. He stayed in the chair by the fire, his Winchester resting across his lap, his back firmly facing the door. For the first time since she was cast out, the fear in Sarah's chest began to thaw, replaced by the steady, rhythmic sound of a man keeping watch in the dark. The blizzard raged for 2 days and 2 nights, a howling beast of white ice and screaming wind that swallowed the mountain whole. Inside the cabin, time slowed to the rhythm of the crackling hearth and the steady, heavy breathing of a woman fighting for her life. Sarah's fever spiked on the first afternoon. The brutal transition from the freezing trail to the warm cabin shocked her system. She tossed under the heavy wolf pelts, her skin flushed, her lips murmuring disjointed, panicked pleas to a husband who was already in the ground. Every time she thrashed, her hands flew to her belly, a fierce, unconscious instinct to protect the child, even while her own mind slipped into delirium. Gideon did not leave her side. He moved with a quiet, tireless efficiency. He pressed cool, damp cloths to her burning forehead. He forced sips of willow bark tea and bone broth past her cracked lips. When she cried out, terrified that Thomas was dragging her back into the cold, Gideon's large, rough hand would gently press against her shoulder, anchoring her to the present. "You're safe," he would say, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through her fever dreams. "I'm right here. Nobody is taking you." He didn't sleep. He sat in the wooden chair beside the cot, his Winchester leaning against the wall within arm's reach, feeding the fire and watching the rise and fall of her chest. He had watched sickness take a woman in this very room once before. He had sworn he would never endure that helplessness again. This time, he was not a desperate husband begging a cowardly town for help. He was a mountain man fighting the winter on his own terms, and he refused to lose. By the evening of the second day, the fever broke. Sarah's breathing evened out, the unnatural flush leaving her cheeks. The violent shivering ceased, replaced by the deep, restorative sleep of a body that had finally stepped back from the edge. Gideon stood over the cot, watching her for a long moment. The tension in his broad shoulders eased just a fraction. He pulled the pelt up closer to her chin and turned away to add another log to the fire. The flames popped, sending a shower of orange sparks up the stone chimney. It was a comforting sound, but underneath the crackle of the wood and the howling of the blizzard, Gideon heard something else. He froze, the iron poker suspended in his hand. To a town dweller, the sound would have been lost in the roar of the storm. But Gideon had spent 5 years learning the language of the mountain. He knew the sound of a pine branch snapping under the weight of snow. He knew the sound of a hungry wolf circling a perimeter. This was night. This was the dull, rhythmic crunch of hooves punching through deep snow, accompanied by the faint jingle of a frozen bridle. Someone was out there. Gideon's pale blue eyes darkened. He set the iron poker down without making a sound. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and picked up the Winchester rifle. He checked the action, a smooth, deadly slide of metal, and walked to the heavy wooden shutters covering the window. He peered through a narrow slit in the wood. Outside, the world was a swirling vortex of white and dark blue shadows. Through the blinding snow, near the edge of the frozen creek, a figure emerged. A man on horseback, heavily bundled against the cold, holding a shielded lantern that cast a weak yellow halo on the snow. The rider was looking at the ground. He was looking for the blood trail. Gideon knew the type. A hired gun. A tracker desperate or greedy enough to risk a mountain blizzard for a paycheck. Thomas had not been satisfied with merely throwing Sarah out to freeze. He wanted confirmation. He wanted to make sure the widow and the unborn heir were dead. On the cot, Sarah stirred, letting out a soft sigh. Gideon looked back at her. She looked fragile, her face pale against the dark fur of the pelts, her hands still resting protectively over her stomach. She had walked 31 miles to find a sanctuary. She had bled for it. A cold, hard fury settled into Gideon's chest. It was not the wild, reckless anger of a younger man. It was the calculated, lethal calm of a predator whose territory had been breached. The town had taken his wife 5 years ago because he had begged. He was done begging. He pulled on his heavy leather gloves and buttoned his bare hide vest. He did not wake Sarah. He simply stepped to the heavy oak door, lifted the iron latch, and slipped out into the howling storm, pulling the door shut tightly behind him. The cold hit Gideon like a physical blow, a wall of freezing air that immediately crystallized the moisture on his eyelashes. He pulled his hat low, shielding his eyes from the biting wind, and stepped off the porch. The snow was knee-deep, but he moved through it with the silent, predatory grace of a man who belonged to the wilderness. Down by the frozen creek, the rider cursed loudly, kicking his exhausted horse forward. The lantern swung wildly, illuminating the rapidly disappearing indentations in the snow, the last remnants of Sarah's trail before the blizzard wiped it clean. "Come on, you stubborn mule," the tracker spat, his voice muffled by a thick wool scarf. She couldn't have gone far on bare feet. "Find the body and we go home." "You're not going home." The voice cut through the roaring wind, calm, flat, and carrying a promise of absolute violence. The tracker jerked his reins, his horse whinnying in panic as it slipped on the ice. He lifted the lantern, squinting into the blinding white snow. Gideon Frost stood less than 15 feet away. He had materialized out of the storm like a ghost. He did not look cold. He did not look afraid. He stood with his feet planted firmly in the deep snow, the Winchester rifle resting casually in his large hands, the barrel pointed directly at the tracker's chest. The tracker's eyes went wide as the lantern light caught the faint, pale scar across Gideon's nose and the icy, piercing blue of his eyes. Every man in the territory knew the stories about the solitary trapper on the ridge. They called him the Wild Man. They said he was merciless. "Frost," the tracker breathed, his hand instinctively twitching toward the revolver at his hip. "Touch that iron and your hand stays in the snow," Gideon said. The timbre of his voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The authority in it was absolute. The tracker froze, his hand hovering inches from his holster. He swallowed hard, the greed that had brought him up the mountain evaporating under Gideon's dead-eyed stare. "I ain't here for you, Frost. I'm looking for a woman, a thief. Stole property from a good family in town. Magistrate put a bounty on her retrieval, dead or alive." "There is no thief here," Gideon said slowly. "The trail leads right to your cabin," the tracker argued, his voice waved. "You go back to Thomas Miller. You tell him the winter took her. You tell him she's dead." "And if I don't?" the tracker sneered, trying to salvage his pride. "What happens when I tell them Gideon Frost is hiding the widow?" Gideon didn't blink. The cold wind howled around them, whipping his dark hair against his weathered face. "Then I come down to the valley," he said simply, "and I burn Thomas Miller's house to the ground with him in it. And then I come for you." The absolute certainty in Gideon's voice sent a violent shiver down the tracker's spine that had nothing to do with the weather. This was not a bluff. This was a man who had nothing left to lose, offering a singular warning. The tracker looked at the dark, imposing cabin in the distance, then back at the muzzle of the rifle. He slowly raised his hands, surrendering. "She's dead," he said, his voice trembling. "Trail went cold at the ridge. Storm buried her. That's what I'll tell him." "Turn your horse around," Gideon commanded. "If I see you on this ridge again, I won't waste words." The tracker didn't hesitate. He yanked the reins hard, turning the exhausted horse back toward the treacherous mountain pass. He didn't look back as he spurred the animal into a desperate, stumbling trot, disappearing into the whiteout. Gideon stood in the snow for a long time, watching the darkness swallow the lantern light. The storm raged on, but the immediate threat was gone. He lowered his rifle, the cold finally seeping into his joints. He turned back toward the cabin. The firelight bleeding through the shutters looked warmer now. He had drawn a line in the snow tonight. He had broken his 5-year vow of isolation. He had made the town's problem his own. And as he opened the heavy oak door and saw Sarah sleeping peacefully by the hearth, he realized he didn't regret it at all. The morning broke with a fragile, blinding clarity. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world buried in waist-deep snow and bathed in brilliant, cold sunlight. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the rich, savory smell of venison stew and baking flatbread. Sarah opened her eyes. For a terrifying second, she didn't know where she was. The heavy wooden beams above her, the smell of wood smoke, the thick pelts, it all belonged to a dream. Then the dull ache in her wrapped feet grounded her, and the memory of the freezing trail and the towering man with pale eyes came rushing back. She turned her head. Gideon was at the stove, using an iron hook to pull a skillet of flatbread away from the flames. He wore a clean flannel shirt, his dark hair damp, as if he had recently washed his face in the snow. He looked less like a wild mountain man in the morning light, though the sheer size and silent intensity of him remained. "You're awake," he said, not turning around. He possessed an uncanny awareness of his surroundings. "I am," Sarah replied, her voice raspy but much stronger than the day before. She pushed herself up onto her elbows. The fever was entirely gone. Her body felt weak, hollowed out by the ordeal, but the baby rested heavily and securely in her womb. Gideon brought a wooden bowl of hot stew and a piece of warm, torn bread to the cot. He set it on a small wooden crate beside her, then pulled up his stool. "Eat," he instructed gently. "Slowly. Your stomach needs to remember how to work." Sarah took the wooden spoon with trembling fingers. The first bite of the rich broth brought tears to her eyes. She hadn't eaten a warm meal since her husband died. She ate in silence, savoring the heat that spread through her chest. Gideon watched her, his expression unreadable, but his presence was a heavy, anchoring weight in the room. When she finished, she set the bowl down and looked at her heavily bandaged feet. "How bad is it?" she asked quietly. "You'll keep your toes," Gideon said, "but you won't be walking on them for a week. The skin needs time to close." Sarah looked up at him. "I can't stay here for a week. The town, Thomas, if they find out I'm alive, they'll come for me. I'll bring them to your door." Gideon thought of the tracker he had turned away in the night. He didn't mention it. She carried enough fear in her eyes already. "Let them come," he said flatly. "They won't get past the porch." Sarah stared at him. "Why are you doing this?" "They say you hate the town. They say you hate everyone." "I do," Gideon replied without hesitation. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "But I don't hate you. And I don't hate the child you're carrying. A man who lets a pregnant woman freeze outside his door isn't a man. He's a coward. I'm not a coward." Sarah's breath hitched. She reached into the pocket of her skirt and pulled out the cracked silver locket. Her thumb rubbed over the dented metal. "You asked why this mattered," she said softly, her eyes locked on the tarnished silver. "Thomas told the magistrate I stole the property deed. My husband, Elias, he knew his brother was greedy. He knew Thomas resented him for inheriting the farm. When Elias got sick, he didn't trust the town's bank or the magistrate with the deed." With a trembling fingernail, Sarah pried open the cracked locket. There was no picture inside. Instead, folded tightly into a tiny, precise square, was a piece of aged parchment. She carefully unfolded it and held it out. It was the original land grant for the Miller farm, signed by the territorial governor. At the bottom, in Elias's familiar, steady handwriting, was a legal transfer. To my beloved wife, Sarah Miller, and our unborn child, all I have is yours. Gideon looked at the paper, then up at Sarah's face. If Thomas finds out I have this, Sarah whispered, a tear escaping down her cheek, he loses the farm. He loses everything. That's why he threw me out in the night. That's why he branded me a thief. He needs me dead before I can show this to a circuit judge. Gideon stared at the fragile piece of paper. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it made his blood run cold. They hadn't just thrown her out, they had tried to erase her. He stood up and walked to a heavy wooden chest at the foot of his own bed. He opened it, the hinges groaning quietly. He reached inside and pulled out a heavy, beautifully tailored wool coat. It was a woman's coat, a deep crimson red, soft and meticulously cared for. It smelled faintly of dried lavender. He brought it to the cot and laid it gently over Sarah's lap. "My wife's," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a low, reverent murmur. "Martha. She was a good woman. The cold took her because the town wouldn't open their doors." Sarah looked at the beautiful coat, then up at the towering, scarred man. "I can't take this," she whispered. "You can," Gideon said firmly, his pale blue eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, protective light. "Because you are going to heal, and when you are strong enough, you are going to put that coat on, and we are going to ride down to that town together. And I am going to make Thomas Miller regret the day he ever learned to speak your name." It was a vow, a promise forged in the fires of a lonely cabin, spoken by a man who had finally found a reason to fight again. Sarah looked into his eyes, and for the first time since her husband died, the crushing weight of her despair began to lift. She pulled the crimson coat against her chest, closed her eyes, and nodded. For 7 days the mountain remained untouched by the outside world. The blizzard had locked the high country in a fortress of ice, granting Sarah the one thing she needed most: time. Under Gideon's silent, watchful care, her body began to repair itself. The frostbite on her heels, treated daily with the sharp-smelling pine salve, closed into tight pink scars. The hollow, haunted look in her hazel eyes softened, replaced by a quiet, simmering resolve. She spent her days sitting by the roaring stone hearth, feeling the strong, steady kicks of her unborn child, a persistent reminder that they had survived the impossible. And she wore the crimson wool coat. At first she had been afraid to touch it, feeling unworthy of the dead woman's memory. But Gideon had draped it over her shoulders one morning when the cabin draft was particularly sharp, his large hands lingering just a second before pulling away. It smelled of dried lavender and safety. Wearing it felt like being wrapped in armor. But armor was only necessary when a battle was coming. On the morning of the 8th day, the sun broke through the clouds with a blinding intensity, beginning the slow melt of the heavy snowpack. The dripping of water from the cabin's eaves sounded like a ticking clock to Sarah. The trail was passable again. Gideon was at the table, running a whetstone along the edge of a heavy hunting knife. The metallic scrape was rhythmic and calming. Sarah sat by the window, mending a tear in one of his flannel shirts. It was a domestic scene, fragile and entirely temporary. Then the dog barked. It wasn't a wolf. It was the sharp, frantic yapping of a town hound. Sarah's hands froze, the needle slipping and pricking her thumb. A drop of blood welled on her skin, but she didn't feel it. The blood in her veins had turned to ice water. Gideon stopped sharpening the knife. He didn't rush. He set the whetstone down, wiped the blade on a cloth, and stood. He walked to the window and pushed the wooden shutter open just an inch. Down at the boundary of his property, where the frozen creek widened before dropping into the valley, a dark mass of figures was emerging from the tree line. There were nearly a dozen of them. On horseback, breath pluming in the cold air. Some carried rifles, others held heavy wooden pitchforks and coiled ropes. In the center of the group, mounted on a fine chestnut mare that had once belonged to Sarah's husband, sat Thomas Miller. He was dressed in a thick, expensive wool coat, playing the part of the aggrieved, righteous townsman perfectly. Beside him rode Magistrate Higgins, looking uncomfortable but compliant, driven by the wealthy Miller family's influence. They had not come for a search. They had come for a lynching. They found a trail, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Her hands moved to her belly, her fingers curling into the heavy crimson wool. The terror she thought she had left behind came rushing back, suffocating and absolute. The tracker. He must have told them. Gideon didn't look back at her. His gaze remained fixed on the mob assembling at the creek. The tracker told them she was dead, he murmured, his voice deadly calm. Thomas didn't believe him. A man who lies for a living trusts no one. There are too many of them, Gideon. If they rush the cabin... They won't, he interrupted. He turned away from the window and walked to the wall where his Winchester hung. He took it down, checked the chamber, and slid a handful of extra cartridges into his coat pocket. He did not look like a man facing impossible odds. He looked like a mountain that had just been told to move. "Stay here," Gideon ordered, moving toward the heavy oak door. "No." The word hung in the air, startling them both. Sarah stood up, her legs trembled, and the new scars on her heels ached fiercely. But she did not fall. She reached into the pocket of the crimson coat and pulled out the cracked silver locket. She opened it, ensuring the folded piece of parchment was still secured inside. "If you go out there alone, they will call you a murderer," Sarah said, her voice shaking but her chin held high. "They will say you kidnapped a helpless widow. Thomas will spin a story that makes him the victim, and they will burn this cabin down with you inside it." Gideon paused, his hand on the iron latch. He looked at her. She was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but the fierce protective instinct of a mother radiated from her like heat from a furnace. "He took my dignity in front of that town," Sarah said, stepping toward him. "I will not let him take yours." Gideon stared at her for a long moment. He saw the fire returning to her eyes, the same fire that had kept her walking for 31 miles on bleeding feet. He gave a single, slow nod. "Walk behind me," he said, "and do exactly as I say." He lifted the iron latch and the heavy door swung open, revealing the blinding white of the snow and the dark, angry mob waiting at the bottom of the ridge. The wind whipped across the frozen creek, carrying the angry murmurs of the townsmen up the ridge. They were cold, impatient, and emboldened by numb. But as the heavy oak door of the cabin swung open, the murmurs died in their throats. Gideon Frost stepped out onto the porch. He didn't raise his rifle. He simply held it across his chest, his large hands resting lightly on the cold metal. He wore no hat, the wind tearing at his dark, unruly hair. His pale eyes swept over the mob, locking on to Thomas Miller with a stare so freezing it made the winter air feel warm. Behind his massive, imposing frame, a smaller figure stepped out into the light. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Sarah Miller stood on the porch, wrapped in a brilliant crimson coat that stood out against the snowy backdrop like a flare. She was not the broken, weeping creature they had driven out of town. She stood tall, her chin raised, her hands resting protectively over the undeniable swell of her pregnancy. Thomas Miller's face went purple with rage. "There she is," he shouted, pointing a gloved finger at the porch. "I told you the wild man had her. She's a thief and an adulteress. Fetch her down here, Magistrate." Magistrate Higgins shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, clearing his throat. "Gideon Frost, by order of the town council, you are harboring a fugitive. Hand over the widow Miller, or we will take her by force." Gideon didn't move. "This is private land, Higgins." His voice boomed over the icy wind, deep and resonant. "The first man who crosses that frozen creek without my invitation stays on this mountain permanently." The absolute certainty in his tone made several men near the front pull their horses back a step. They had come to bully a widow, not to fight a man who looked like he hunted bears for sport. "She stole the deed to my brother's farm," Thomas screamed, sensing the crowd's hesitation. "She took what belongs to my family. She is property of the law." "I stole nothing," Sarah's voice rang out, sharp and clear. She stepped around Gideon, standing shoulder to shoulder with the towering mountain man. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but the solid presence of Gideon beside her anchored her to the earth. "You threw me out in the night so I would freeze to death, Thomas," she called down to the crowd. "You told the town I was a thief so they would turn a blind eye to my murder." "Lies," Thomas spat, spurring his horse a few feet forward, right to the edge of the ice. "You have no proof, you wretched whore. You have nothing." Sarah reached into her crimson coat. Her fingers closed around the cold silver of the locket. She pulled it out, snapping it open. With trembling hands, she extracted the folded parchment, shaking it out until the territorial seal was visible even from a distance. "I have the original land grant," Sarah shouted, holding the paper high in the cold air. "Signed over to me and my unborn child by Elias Miller on his deathbed. It is legally notarized by the state circuit judge in Denver. Elias knew you would try to steal his legacy, Thomas. He knew exactly what you were." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the mob. Magistrate Higgins squinted at the paper in her hand. The territorial seal was unmistakable. If the document was real, and it certainly looked real, Thomas Miller had just committed perjury, attempted murder, and fraud. "It's a forgery!" Thomas shrieked, his voice cracking with panic. He yanked his rifle from its scabbard, kicking his horse forward onto the frozen creek. "I'll kill you myself!" Before Thomas could even level his weapon, the deafening crack of a Winchester rifle split the mountain air. Thomas's horse screamed, rearing up on its hind legs as a bullet shattered the ice less than an inch from its front hooves. Thomas lost his balance, tumbling backward out of the saddle and crashing hard onto the frozen creek. His rifle skittered away across the ice. Up on the porch, Gideon Frost had the Winchester pressed to his shoulder, smoke curling from the barrel. His pale eyes were devoid of mercy. He racked the lever, chambering another round with a sharp, terrifying click. "Get up," Gideon commanded. Thomas groaned, clutching his bruised shoulder, staring in sheer terror at the barrel of the rifle pointed squarely at his chest. Gideon didn't look at Thomas. He looked at the magistrate and the stunned townsman. "You came up here to do the bidding of a liar and a coward." Gideon's voice was low, but it carried to every man present. "Take a good look at him. This is the man you followed. He sends a pregnant woman into a blizzard, and when she survives, he tries to shoot her in the back." The men in the crowd looked at each other. The righteous fury that had brought them up the mountain dissolved into profound, creeping shame. They looked at Sarah, wrapped in red, holding the proof of her innocence. Then they looked at Thomas, groveling on the ice. "Magistrate Higgins," Sarah said, her voice steady, "if you do not arrest Thomas Miller for fraud and attempted murder right now, I will take this deed to the federal marshals in Denver, and I will ensure they know you were an accomplice." Higgins turned pale. He looked at the federal seal on the paper, then at the smoking rifle in Gideon's hands. He swallowed hard.
Safe now.
"Bind him," Higgins ordered, gesturing weakly to two of the townsmen.
I didn't think I'd see
Thomas
you
thrashed
again.
and screamed as his own neighbors pulled him roughly from the ice, tying his hands behind his back.
Gotcha.
"You can't do this.
Now.
That land is mine. She's a thief." No one
I
listened.
didn't think
The
I'd
illusion of
see
his
you
power had been
again.
shattered by a single piece of paper and the unbreakable will of the man standing on the porch. The mob turned their horses in silence, dragging Thomas Miller back down the mountain, leaving nothing behind but the hollow echo of his screams. The silence that reclaimed the mountain was heavy and profound.
Come inside.
The mob was gone, their tracks already beginning to blur as the wind picked up,
It's all right.
erasing the ugly intrusion of the town from the pristine white valley. On the porch, Sarah slowly lowered the deed. Her hands, gripped so tightly with adrenaline, began to shake violently. The sheer magnitude of what had just happened crashed over her. She had faced her abuser. She had won. She was safe. Her knees buckled. Before she could hit the rough wooden floorboards, Gideon was there. He caught her by the waist, his large, warm hand steadying her against his side. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask if she was all right. He simply held her upright, absorbing her trembling until she found her footing again. "They're gone," Sarah whispered, staring at the empty, frozen creek. "They're gone," Gideon echoed. He lowered the Winchester, sliding his hand from her waist to gently guide her back toward the open cabin door. "Come inside. The wind is turning." They stepped back into the cabin. The heat of the roaring stone hearth wrapped around them, instantly soothing the bite of the mountain air. Sarah walked to the fire, holding her hands out to the flames. She looked at the small, one-room cabin, the heavy wooden table, the thick wolf pelts on the cot, the tin cup she drank from every morning. It was a fortress, but standing here now, with the threat finally broken, it felt like something else. "The magistrate will process the deed," Gideon said, setting the rifle back on its hooks. He walked over to the stove and began to pour hot water into the tin basin. "Thomas will go to the territorial prison. The farm is yours. When the pass clears completely next week, I can hitch the wagon, take you back down." Sarah turned away from the fire. Gideon stood with his back to her, scrubbing his scarred hands in the basin. His shoulders were tense, the easy, fluid motion of his survival routines suddenly rigid. He was offering her the choice. He was giving her back her freedom, asking for nothing in return. He had saved her life, fought a mob for her, and now he was preparing to step back into his isolation. "I don't want the farm," Sarah said quietly. Gideon's hand stopped moving. He didn't turn around. "It's your home. It's your child's inheritance. A house full of ghosts and neighbors who watched me freeze is not a home," Sarah replied. She walked slowly across the room, the crimson coat brushing against the floorboards. She stopped just behind him. "I walked 31 miles to get away from that place." Gideon finally turned. The fierce, terrifying protector who had stared down a mob moments ago was gone. In his place stood a man who was deeply, painfully lonely, looking at her with a vulnerability he hadn't shown in 5 years. "The mountain is harsh, Sarah," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "It's cold, and I am not an easy man to live with. You are the only man who ever treated me like a human being," Sarah said. He reached out, her small, pale hand resting gently on his massive forearm. "You opened your door when the whole world shut theirs. You gave me your warmth. You gave me a safe place." She looked up into his pale blue eyes. "I don't want to go back. I want to stay here." Gideon looked at her hand on his arm. He looked at the fierce, beautiful woman wearing his late wife's coat, carrying a child that would soon fill this silent cabin with noise and life. The ice around his heart, frozen solid for 5 long years, finally cracked and fell away completely. He reached up, his rough, scarred fingers gently